Good evening, everybody. I'm Julia Glass, and I'm one of the co-founders of 20 Summers, and I have been looking forward to this evening for so long that I can't tell you how nervous I am. I can't believe we're finally here. This is actually the third event of our second season, and we're so happy to be back at the barn, and I want to thank a few people. First, I want to thank our presenting sponsor, Comcast, which is filming tonight's event, and also WCAI, which is also recording it. So this event will be well archived, and there will be many opportunities for people who aren't lucky enough to be here tonight to see and hear this event. I also want to thank our official bookseller, the Provincetown Bookshop. Thank you, Nan. I'm sure some of you are responsible for the continued survival of one of the best independent bookstores I know. We would also like to thank Patrick and John Jay from the Inn at Cook Street, which has been one of our most generous hosts, putting up some of our special guests, and we really appreciate that kind of support. So thank you guys. We also want to thank Daniel Kaiser and Adam Moss, who own this beautiful barn and are responsible for restoring it so lovingly and respectfully. And we are very fortunate to rent this barn from them for 1 month every spring. And so thank you very much, Daniel and Adam. You know, I had sort of prepared some remarks, but I mean, do these guys really need introduction? I'm going to say a couple things, though, because I have to. I am not the only person in this room who's an enormous admirer of both of these writers. And although one could say that they write in different sort of venues, different genres, they had different childhoods, maybe they'll talk a little bit about that, but they both grew up to be absolutely remarkable raconteurs. And the one thing I would say that they have in common is that if you walk into a bookstore or you open a magazine and you see either of their names, you think, oh, good. You know, I can't wait to just find a corner, moment to myself to really immerse myself in what I know is going to be an amazing story. Because they both are entertaining, they're both funny, they're both moving. They are, I just always feel like I know I'm going to be astonished by these two writers. So I'm quite sure that they're going to astonish us this evening. They're going to actually just talk amongst themselves for about 45 minutes or so. I figured, they are probably the best interviewers of themselves. And after that, we're going to open it up to audience questions. And then, as I said, after that, hopefully people will buy books and have them signed. So without further ado, I would like to welcome to the barn and 20 Summers, Adam Gopnik and Michael Cunningham.
Thank you. Thank you. So Michael, I thought I should say that in case people couldn't tell us apart.
Yeah, right. Yeah. We're often mistaken for each other.
Yes, all the time. It happens on the streets of Provincetown.
Just quickly, thank you for that lovely introduction. Thank you all for being here.
Absolutely. And it's wonderful to be here in Provincetown. And one of the things we were talking about is that both of us, among the things we do have in common, is we both love writing about places. We are
guys who write about places.
We do, and we both like going places and then writing about them,
right,
and then finding it
well,
too.
And I think, and we're guys who have moved to fairly dramatically new places
at various times in our life, and done that. But I wanted to ask you, Michael, when did you first come to Provincetown, and when did you discover Provincetown sort of as a place you could subjectify and mythologize in some way?
I came to Provincetown as a fellow at this fantastic institution called the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, which offers young writers and visual artists a 7-month residency, replete with a studio and a stipend. It's the best deal there is.
Right.
And I had never really. I'm from Los Angeles. I'd never, at the time, really been to the East Coast, and when I told people I was going to spend the winter in Provincetown, people said, well, it gets a little quiet there.
But you thought quiet like Malibu, right?
I thought that meant, there won't be a 24-hour market.
Right.
Okay. And of course I got here, and it was just, in the winter, it's very, very, very quiet. It's very, very quiet. Everything is
not California quiet, really.
No. There are
quiet.
nights in February when you're walking down Commercial Street and you think, towns in Siberia must be like this. And it was rough. It was a rough winter. But then I stayed for the summer and fell in love with the town, with a man.
Man in the town,
and somehow it's 30 years later, and it is my favorite place, really, in the world.
Spiritual home of a.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if this is the ultimate test, but this is where I would want my ashes scattered when I die at the end of this interview from the ecstasy of talking to Adam Gopnik for an entire hour.
Scattering ashes is a significant thing.
I want
the
you all
most
to
beautiful
know.
ash scattering scene that I know of in literature is in Snow Queen. In your
book. Thank you.
That is such a. I don't know if any of you've read it because it captures the absurdity of trying to scatter ashes. You have to get the canister open.
Yeah, right.
And the ashes, because we, for various reasons, have had to scatter ashes from the Pont des Arts in Paris. And just last summer, my wife's father died at 95, and we were trying to think where to go with his ashes. And at one point, we thought that we would rent a big SUV and take our family, my wife's sister's family, and his mistress all out in an SUV together to leave the ashes of this 95-year-old man in Sag Harbor or someplace. And our son pointed out, said, this sounds like the plot of the worst indie movie ever made. So we didn't do it, and we ended up scattering his ashes on the median on Park Avenue, which was actually a place that he was particularly...
Oh, I like that.
I think it was probably against every imaginable regulation of the New York Health Department, but we did it. But, I first came to the Cape sort of romantically. Martha, my wife, and I sort of took our honeymoon before we were married, and we went to Orleans. Then we started coming back in 1986 to Wellfleet, where we've been renting a house every year since. But really what brought us to Provincetown was our dog. I told you this story? We, about 5 years ago, we finally succumbed to my daughter Olivia's, who's in the audience tonight, desperate pleas, and we bought a little Havanese, adorable little Upper East Side dog, and we started taking her to Wellfleet, obviously with us in the summers. And the thing is, the house we rent in Wellfleet is up on the dunes, and we love it. It's beautiful, secluded. We think of it as idyllic. But Butterscotch recognized instantly that it was probably the worst neighborhood she had ever been in her life, because with the sense of smell and hearing that a dog has, right? She realized that we were surrounded accurately by desperately hungry predators, right? That there were coyotes and raccoons.
Suddenly Butterscotch
and foxes
was prey. Butterscotch was
prey,
food.
and she knew it too. And she would either whine piteously or growl desperately at the door. She was having a nervous breakdown.
Well, I actually
every
felt
night.
like that first
yes,
winter.
Exactly. and the thing is, she was right. You know, I mean, it was like she. You felt that way. You were whining and growling, and that and she was right, because in fact we were encircled by desperate predators who would have broken in and eaten all of our food and devoured our little dog if they'd had the chance. So we thought, we put her on her leash and we brought her to Provincetown that first summer. And you could see her little body relaxing the moment she struck on Commercial Street, because every smell was familiar to her. You know,
right.
Cologne on fudge, dog pee, and you could just see. And you had to drag her back like a fish into the car to get her to go back to Wellfleet and the terrifying, beautiful house, right, where she's surrounded. And we used to say she was sort of like a Republican with good reasons, right? Yeah. She was convinced. She had a paranoid conviction that she was surrounded by enemies. But she was, actually. And so since then, we come to Provincetown pretty much every night when we're in Wellfleet.
For Butterscotch.
Just for Butterscotch, just to ease the anxiety a bit.
Right.
Just for her to come down.
This also seems especially appropriate to talk about in Provincetown, because it is very much a place people come to for all kinds of reasons. A quick show of hands: is anybody from Provincetown originally here?
No, it's not possible. Right.
There are no hands. We've all arrived here. Right. Whether for a short while or the rest of our lives, and maybe when we get to talk among ourselves, we could talk a little bit about what brought us to Provincetown, what we were or Wellfleet or Truro, what brought us out to this beautiful remote place.
It's endlessly interesting, and we were just talking before that we went out to Iceland a few weeks ago because my wife's family comes from there, and I was doing something. And actually, one of the dignitaries in Iceland said, and we will confront over the next 2 weeks the perpetual question, what brought us to this remote and barren island? and it's true. One of the things I wrote once for the New Yorker was a thing about Thoreau's Cape Cod, right, about his book about it. And it is astonishing when you read it and you realize it was his Iceland. The thing that made Cape Cod in the 19th century was the sense that it was a barren place, fascinatingly barren, but barren above all, not sociable. The last thing you would imagine is fried clams and suntan oil on the beach. The beach was the last place you'd ever want to be.
But no, it was wild. People built houses anywhere. There were no streets, and you build a house on the top of a dune, and it would just gradually slide down.
Yeah, exactly.
It wasn't especially disconcerting to anybody. It's eventually you lived at the bottom of the dune.
Exactly. It was part of the barrenness and the wilderness of the place.
And I just quickly have to add this because it's one of my favorite Provincetown stories. Provincetown has been predicting its own demise since its founding. In the late 1800s, the streets, there were still no paved anything. It was all sand, but there were sort of streetish avenues of sand. And right in the middle of town, where like Adam's drug store is, the town, I'm sure I don't think there were many town mothers at the time. I suspect they were fathers. Sort of decreed that there would be built a 2-block stretch of just wooden sidewalk. And many of the locals were so convinced that this was the end of the soul of Provincetown. Right. This was the beginning of corruption. It was going to be fried clams and suntan oil before you knew it. That various townspeople refused to set foot
on the walkway.
And some of the local women would stand at the edge because they had to get to Adam's drugstore. It was the only drugstore in town until a gallant would come and agree to carry them over.
So Japanese.
Over this little bit of plank that was the end of the town as they knew it.
Amazing.
And carry them into Adam's drugstore. And we continue to this day to believe that we're on the brink of the end of the Provincetown.
I do that with my wife just as a kind of custom. Just as I'm constantly carrying her into Adam's drugstore. She's a bit of a hypochondriac, and she needs many a medication along the way. One of the pleasures of getting ready for this evening, though, Michael, has been for me is I was able to do my due diligence in Cunninghamiana and really read right through as many of your novels as I could manage. And one of the other things that struck me reading it that we actually have in common with all the things that we don't is that we are both very elusive writers. I think we probably would be better off if we were more elusive writers like Salinger and Don DeLillo, and we had the glamour of the unobtainable. Instead, we go anywhere and talk to everyone. But we both love writing that has in the background what the academics call interlineated writing, so that most famously in The Hours is both a novel of American life and a meditation on Virginia Woolf, and in Snow Queen, that absolutely wonderful book, has Hans Andersen behind it. It also has Chekhov within it. It has Flaubert as part of it, too. And for me, the thing that makes your books miraculous is that you never feel the weight of a pedant on the page. You only feel that those things are illuminating the book from within. But but it must have been a moment when you realized that you could bring your reading to your writing, in a sense, that didn't have to be segregated out, that what you knew about books, your place in history of writing.
It never really occurred to me that I had to leave Virginia Woolf and Walt Whitman out of my novels any more than it would have occurred to, I think, any number of novelists that they had to leave out their
their grandmother,
this guy's
right.
parents,
yeah.
or their first disappointing love affair. I think you simply put into your books that which is most important, that which occupies you most. And I'm mostly thinking about What's for Dinner and Walt Whitman. So,
right. So the books have to be built out of.
Yeah. And I really don't actually read reviews or anything like that, but one hears, and one sometimes hears things that are not what you really want to hear. And I know there's some Michael Cunningham is trying to sort of class up the act by bringing in his betters, and that's really not my intent. I have all kinds of corrupt intentions, but that's actually not really one of them. These are simply the writers who sort of formed my imagination. They're the writers I read when I was young, and I never recovered.
Yeah, I think this is true. I know that I do, and those same reviews that I never read either, but that you hear about somehow through the thing, make similar kinds of claims. I do it at a micro level, right? Partly because I've never gotten to the macro level of actually writing a full book, but at the micro level, the thing that I enjoy doing, and that seems to somehow seep naturally into the sentences that I write, is a sense of all the kind of other imaginative forces that are out there that can play on the sentences. I wrote a piece once called "The Death of a Fish," an essay about our daughter's goldfish dying, our bluefish dying, and the piece ended up very much being about Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo, because Martha, my wife, decided that we would never tell Olivia that her goldfish had died. We would simply replace it with a look-alike goldfish, kind of Kim Novak goldfish that she would never be able to tell the difference from. And that came to bear, and the questions of the philosophy of consciousness came up, because the question is, did her goldfish ever know that it was alive in any reasonable sense, as she did? But none of it was self-conscious. I wasn't like I was thinking, what weight can you bring to bear? And the terrible thing about it is that Olivia was 6 when it happened, didn't know until she read the book when she was about 13, I think, that the goldfish had died and been replaced, and that she didn't know that because we had told her terribly, against our son's recommendations, that the first goldfish had gone to the fish hospital, and she had still believed that he was in the fish hospital, sort of on an extended assisted fish living program through all of these years. But I do think that it's a function of the reality that one of the chief things you are as a writer is a reader, so that Walt Whitman in Specimen is part of one of the people you know in a very real sense.
Yeah. The way I know actual living people. Walt Whitman happens to be a deceased person,
yes,
and I know him through his work, but I don't see such a big difference, really. That's kind of crazy, really, but it's true.
No, I think it's right, and I think the test of it always is that. It's a weird thing, is that as long as you know you're in yourself that it's completely unwilled, then I think it's legitimate. In other words, because Walt Whitman is a friend of yours in some way, or an intimate of a particular kind, he belongs there. And in the same way, I always feel any illusion that comes without premeditation is legitimate. And it's a little bit like it's the same principle as whenever you will comic essay. In other words, if you drowned, or you couldn't drown it, the opposite. If you pulled your daughter's fish out of the water in order to get a funny piece out of it, the artificiality, not to mention the cruelty, would be apparent in some way or another on the page. When we were living in Paris, I was in putting together what eventually became Paris the Moon. I remember there was a particular moment, Michael, when I thought, what I'll do next is I'll learn to drive, because that will be very funny, learning to drive in Paris. And I realized at that moment, no, that would be shtick then, because then I start looking for things to do that will be funny to do because I'm doing them in Paris. And really, that was the moment I said, we really have to go home, because up till this point, everything has been real. Weird, funny things that happened were actual weird, funny things that happened.
Yeah.
They weren't weird, funny things I went out looking for in order to do my Gopnik in Paris shtick. And that was the moment I knew that they had to come. Is there something like that in writing a novel, when you know this sort of when your imagination is working properly on its own terms, as opposed to when you're trying to force an imagination?
No. Not really. Yeah, but you can trick yourself. You can realize, oh, you know, that felt real, but it, you know, it depends on the day. But ultimately, yes, you spend enough time with a novel, and you have, and by the way, you have a small SWAT team of trusted readers
who are your trusted readers? Who do you show your stuff to?
I show it to Adam Moss and Daniel Kaiser.
Good choice.
Right back there. I show it to Ken Corbett and a poet named Marie Howe, one or two other people, and I rely on them to not only sort of separate the genuine from the I wish it were genuine, right. But to help me translate it into earth language. I mean, I think that's part of what any writer is doing. I don't know how you feel about this. I feel like we're all working from our own private system of symbology and resonance and coding, and part of what you need help with, what I need help with when I get to a sort of penultimate draft, is some input from the people of Earth who I count on to tell me, I know that on your planet, this is a tremendously potent symbol. Actually, to the people of Earth, yes, it's just a chair.
No, exactly. No.
It's just a knife. It's just a rolling pin. It's just whatever.
And I think that's exactly right. You know, in fact, it was very weird when I was reading The Snow Queen, as I think I mentioned to you, Michael. The Snow Queen, which everyone should read, starts with a scene on the Great Lawn in Central Park when one of the protagonists has this vision of I should look over this side of the audience, has a vision that he can't account for that changes his life and then motivates a great deal of the action of the book. Yeah. And I wrote adventure fantasy for children called The Steps Across the Water, which begins with a scene where the protagonist on the Great Lawn in Central Park has a vision, which it turns out ultimately has been sent to her by the Snow Queen, by a character that she sees. They are the steps across the water, which she eventually takes to another city, to the city of Unork, which is to New York as New York is to Provincetown. And it was uncanny. And the point was, I thought, that we both had been drawn at some point in our childhood, I wonder when it was with you, Michael, to the incredibly potent myth of the Snow Queen and the sliver of ice in the eye that Kay gets. Did that change your life at some?
It did. It did absolutely. You know, a quick recap of the Snow Queen. It involved a sort of cursed mirror which shatters, and the shards are blown all around the world. And if you are unfortunate enough to get one stuck in your eye or your heart, you suddenly see the world as a bleak and terrible and hopeless place, and believe that you're seeing it truly for the first time, that the proverbial scales have fallen from your eyes. And then this boy named Kai is kidnapped by the Snow Queen and has to be rescued by his friend Gerda, who not only needs to rescue him physically from the Arctic stronghold of the Snow Queen, but also bring him back emotionally. Yeah. And that's odd for a fairy tale. Yes. Usually you have to get Rapunzel out of the tower, you have to get Cinderella's foot into the slipper, but there aren't that many fairy tales that involve the need to rescue somebody from despair.
No, exactly. And
I like that.
It's fabulous. And I sense that it's a very important fable for you, very important fairy tale. Because it actually ends up being the story that you're telling in The Snow Queen. But I think it's a story you tell often, actually, in your work, about someone who has gotten a sliver of ice in their eye or in their heart and has to be brought back to life in another way. And I found myself having done it. I can't tell you how many times in my work I've told that story. I remember using it in 1987 or so when I was writing about Jeff Koons for the first time. I actually talked about that a whole generation had gotten a sliver of ice in their eye, and that the Koons bunny, that armored thing, was the Snow Queen's bunny. In that way. And I retold it in Steps Across the Water. I did a book about winter, a series of essays on lectures that really in Canada. About winter, and that was in trying to understand the romantic idea of winter. That was by far the most potent thing, because exactly as you say, not only what happens to Kay is not only do the scales fall from his eyes, but then he sees the dead mineral forms of winter as though they were the richest organic things in the world. He sees that snowflakes are infinitely lovelier than flowers, or comes to believe under the control of the Snow Queen that they are. So it's not just that he's giving something up and going dead, it's that he has an alternate vision of value in the world, which involves the fetishization of the unliving, of the cold and unliving. Such a powerful story, and I was so overwhelmed to find you retelling it as well in Snow Queen.
Who knew?
Who knew?
Well, one of the things I've learned from publishing novels and talking to people about them is how terrified we are of sorrow. People will come up to me, this was especially true with my novel The Hours, and say, after reading something like, I wasn't going to read your book because I was afraid it was going to be depressing, but several of my friends assured me that I would probably survive the experience intact, and I read it, and I'm glad I did. And
they were still alive at the end. It's not like, what's that Japanese movie, right, where everybody sees the thing and kills themselves?
Yeah, I know. I'm going to write, that's my next book. Right. Everybody sees the thing and just kills themselves. And on an uncranky day, I was going, well, I'm glad you're wrong. But I have found myself, when I've been just out of sorts and on tour too long, saying something like this, and it's a little cruel, I admit it, but I don't mean it cruelly. I say, okay, 2 questions. Number 1, does your hold on happiness feel so precarious to you that you think a 250-page novel is going to knock you into a slough of despond from which you will not return? Do you believe that? Second question, isn't a certain amount of sorrow and regret and anger and all the full range of these, let's say, darker emotions part of the ride? Isn't that part of being alive? I mean, you don't want a constant diet of that. You want your joy as well, but there's a richness in sorrow, and I've been a little bit surprised by how many people have expressed to me their reluctance to even contemplate, to expose themselves to any experience that might make them sad.
You know what's so peculiar about that, though, Michael, is that it's something that the great popular artists understand instinctively and make work. I once was trying and failed to write a profile of Paul McCartney for the New Yorker. And for complicated reasons, it didn't work out. But I remember that when I was talking to McCartney about his work, he said the crucial thing is that the songs have to be sad. He said all the most successful songs I've ever written, Yesterday is the first one that comes to mind, are about sadness. And he said something to the effect that songs give people a right to have their own melancholy emotions. And we're the people who give people the right to be sad about their experience of love. And that always stuck with me as a true remark, and in a certain way a profound remark. And certainly if you think about great popular song, it tends not to be cheer up music. It tends to be make you blue music. It tends to be, that's the most potent form of it that we have. People listen to Patsy Cline and Waylon Jennings. I know you were wearing a Waylon Jennings t-shirt earlier today. Before they listen to Lawrence Welk. And it's an odd thing. I think you're right that people feel that way. But when you actually consult what people, the art that people have the most immediate appetite for, it's almost always about heartbreak. In fact, forgive me, I'm mentioning, but I actually got a profile of Willie Nelson written once. I actually got to spend a week in the bus with Willie Nelson, and I did a profile of him.
Your life is so much more cool than mine.
Well, that's the cool thing about writing journalism, is you get to do things like you get to break up the monotony of writing with actually going places.
And I'm still in my underwear at 4 p.m.
I am too.
But reheating the morning's coffee at a saucepan.
Believe me, on Willie Nelson's bus, everyone is still in their underwear at 4 p.m. Everyone is still in their underwear, and the smoke is too thick.
Could we just talk a little bit about optimism and sorrow? Because all my books have happy endings.
Yes, this is true.
I didn't
even if they're guardedly happy, or even if they're kind of happiness emerging from.
Yeah. It's something I'm aware of in Virginia Woolf. Virginia Woolf suffered from bouts of something for which the term depression seems a little mild. Right. It's hard to imagine anyone better acquainted with the deepest depths, and at the same time, I don't know a writer who left a body of work that speaks so convincingly and truly and directly about the joy of being alive.
No, we were
on a Tuesday in London.
Has more rhapsodic pressure per square inch of English prose than Virginia Woolf can manage when she's talking about a woman going to buy the flowers for a party. No, I think that...
And I when I read her when I was young and learned a little bit about her life, I thought, if somebody who's been where Virginia Woolf has been can come back and say it's worth it, it's rife with beauties, I believe her.
Yeah. And
this isn't as conscious as it sounds when you're talking about it, but I've noticed that every novel I've written ends with life going on, with something continuing. I don't kill all the characters like certain Japanese writers like to, but I only trust an optimism that survives the worst that can possibly happen.
And the earned optimism of the imagination.
Yeah.
Well, it's a funny thing because it's true. I was saying it's true about great popular art, and I was going to just finish what Willie Nelson said to me on the bus, which is that he said the key thing to performing was taught to me by an old country singer when I first started out. And he said, remember when you stand up there and you're looking out over the audience, remember that 95% of them are there with their second choice. And he said, so any song you sing that's about somebody who's there, right, who's left their love behind is going to be true for 95% of the audience. And it was such a cold, calculating thing to think about, right? They're all out there with their second choice, but it stuck with me. But the other odd thing is that it's absolutely true, and it's not sufficiently appreciated, I think, about Virginia Woolf, though you do and have articulated it, is how much of the content of the great modernist literature we admire is fundamentally, after a great deal, affirmative. I once, and this shows you what a terrible person I am to spend a summer with, I decided here in Wellfleet that I would make my reading for the summer Finnegan's Wake, because I had never read Finnegan's Wake, and I thought, this is a great beach book. Everyone is saying, this is a great beach book. I got to take it there.
I love you for that.
Well, I struggled my sunglasses on sunblock on Finnegan's Wake.
Let's
go
to the beach.
I was working my way through it, and and it was great turns, a lot of drama, a lot of excitement, affairs, and so on. But when you finish it, when you finally finish this book, whether it's worth the effort required is a question we could debate. But when you finally finish it, what you realize is that Joyce is saying, in this very old-fashioned way almost, he's saying there are these two principles in life, and Pace, whether this is accurate, but what he's saying is there's a feminine principle in life that's embodied in rivers and all that flows. There's a masculine principle in life that's embodied in mountains and all that's solid and obnoxious. The feminine principle is superior to the mountain principle. The river flows forever on and the mountain erodes. That's the sum total of Joyce's view. I've saved you an enormous amount.
No one has to read Finnegan's Wake.
Now you don't have to read Finnegan's Wake. But it's finally about, that's what the book is about. That's finally what it...
Yeah. Well, Ulysses, which is a walk in the park compared to Finnegan's Wake, ends with Molly Bloom's soliloquy, and the end of the book is, yes, I said yes, I will. Yes.
It's an affirmation.
James Joyce, mean, old, cranky, bow before my genius. James Joyce was actually writing a story that conspired toward the word that ends with the word yes.
Exactly. And I was struck by it again in I thought the most thrilling art show I've seen in years. No surprise, right? Was the Matisse cutouts.
Oh God!
At Moment, did you see them?
Yeah. The thing about they don't photograph.
No, not at all.
They flatten out. You have to see them in person.
You have to see them. And even though I thought I knew that work well and sort of went dutifully, it was the most hair-raising. It took the top of your head off
I know.
see it. And one of the things that was so amazing about it is it's all about It's all about aeronautics, all about the air and the water. It's really what its subject is. No, the last one is the parrot and the mermaid, because that's what it's about. It's about form, dissolving and transforming in air and water. And what's astonishing is its content in some ways is so simple and almost sentimental, right? That in the simple act of physical displacement of things that jump in the air and things that dive in the ocean, you can enter into a totally transformational, imaginative universe.
Well, I think sentimentality gets a bit of a bad rap.
God, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like if I were to describe what I do, I would say I try to write books that go right to the edge of sentimentality, but I hope not over the edge.
Well, I would say try to write essays that go right over the edge and then find something on the other side of it that matters.
Yeah.
It's funny. I just was looking. I was thinking about using for the epigraph of the next book, of the book I'm working on right now, this beautiful quote from Charles Peirce, the great American philosopher, where he said, "What do we really mean by sentimentality?" He said, "Except to pay great attention to the judgments of the living heart." Isn't that lovely? Isn't that a beautiful quote? And I think that's true. And, there's certain words that the wrong kinds of critics, who we never read, use automatically that I always think are suspect. And almost without exception, because the next word alongside it is the accurate word. In other words, what sentimentality exists, and we all know things that we think are unduly sentimental and we don't care for. But almost invariably, if what's called sentimentality is well done, it's immediately replaceable by tender and charming, right?
Yeah.
Salinger's stories about kids are not, in fact, sentimental. They're tender and charming.
Yeah.
I often have thought that pretentious is another one of those things, because it's very rarely a case where any work of art, where if you like the work of art, it's simply ambitious. It's simply ambitious. And you say, wow, Joyce got all of the world down in one book.
Yeah.
What an ambitious thing to do.
Yeah.
And if you don't care for it, you say, oh, my God, if only he'd stuck to writing those beautiful stories in Dubliners and he went off in this horribly pretentious
Almost
direction.
Every book I love could legitimately be called pretentious
and sentimental, right?
On,
yes, exactly.
Depending on how it strikes you.
Exactly.
But yeah. No, I teach undergraduates, and they're fantastic and are so terrified of being obvious,
right,
or sentimental, that their stories aren't really about much of anything at all sometimes. And part of my job, or my self-appointed job, is to get them to rough it up and risk it. And I sometimes say to them, here's the thing. As far as I can tell, you can't really be certainly a fiction writer and be cool.
Yeah.
The fiction writer is the kind of sweaty kid with the bad skin and the unfortunate glasses
shirt
frame,
falling out of his pants, and
possibly attached to his head by some elastic contrivance, who sits down at the cool kids' table and talks to them earnestly about love. And when we talk about risk-taking in writing, I feel like that's really the big risk we're talking about, is exposing your own earnestness, exposing that you actually give a shit about this stuff.
Yeah, you get the uncool kid at the table. That's a wonderful image. That's true. I think the essayist is the kid who's so uncool that he doesn't even come into the lunchroom. He's still sitting in the library, right? And you can't even persuade him to come out. But I think that's absolutely true. Just to italicize that point, I think there's not a novel by Dickens that we could not call just as well sentimental and pretentious as call it ambitious and heart-searing. And I think that's true about any literature I admire, really love and live with in the intimate way we want to.
Paul Bowles. I mean, we go on the map.
Yes, we
could
certainly.
But yes, there are the books that I love, the books that drive the ice pick into whatever's left of my heart. It's hard to find anymore.
Right,
but the bits that are still in here somewhere are the books that push it. Are the Great Gatsby, Ulysses, Moby Dick, the books that risk doing too much, the books that imply that it's better to go down in big blue-green flames than it is to write a lovely
perfectly
little story
right.
that doesn't risk embarrassing the writer.
That's right. No, I think
terrible.
it's...
Why do we... no,
Why do we...
No, we're not... I'm not going to get us into complaining about being a writer. I hate when writers talk about that.
I know, right? Being a... I'll ask you a question about that, because it's something that I've felt very much. You know, I've been writing now sort of full-time for 30-some years, right?
Yeah,
I
me
really
too,
started...
about.
Yeah, 1980 is when I really started writing. Oh, and I will... quick story is, so... my children who are here today love, who are not children at all anymore, who are young people, but they love Malcolm Gladwell, right? You know, as who does not? They always, we refer to him in our family as not that you're not dead, Malcolm, because whenever Malcolm comes over, they say, you know, Malcolm is just the greatest storyteller, not that you're not dead. Malcolm finds the one right example to illuminate, not that you don't dead, and then they love him. So Luke, my son, came to me a while ago and said, do you agree with Malcolm's 10,000 hours thing? Probably everyone has heard the idea, right? It takes 10,000 hours of continuous work in order to master anything. The Beatles in Hamburg, the example he gives. And I said, well, you know, I love Malcolm like a brother, but he probably is roughing it off there. And Luke said, well, when did you start writing seriously? And I said, in the fall of 1980, when your mom and I came to New York, and I sat down there in a basement room with a typewriter, as it was then, and started writing. He said, well, how many hours a day and how long? We figured it out. He said, okay, then your 10,000 hours were up in May of 1986. And I started, because that's when my first piece was published in The New Yorker, was in May of 1986, after 6 years of trying. So I called Malcolm on the phone, and I said, you son of a bitch, how could you? And he said, well, if you think about it, it's the joke is, the gimmick is, that we don't think in terms of hours, usually when we're counting out. And all 10,000 hours is 6 years. It's 6 years. And if you think about it, any professional program you undertake, law school, medical school, anything else, is a 6-year program. You do 4 years of work and then 2 years as an intern or a resident or as a clerk or something, and then you'll do it. And a little light bulb went off on me, and I realized, and ever since, to the degree that I ever have, you know, apprentices or students to say, I say, you have to make a 6-year commitment, right? Exactly the same commitment you'd make going into medical school or going into law school. I don't know if it worked that way for you, but I think that's sort of where you can begin to make a sane judgment.
It worked slightly differently for me, though I think time figures in. I had been writing and sending story after story after story to The New Yorker. Could have been any place that happened to be The New Yorker, because The New Yorker is The New Yorker. You work there. I just get rejected now, but I was once accepted by The New Yorker. And I sent them story after story after story, and they just came back and back and back, and they began to be accompanied by nicer notes.
Yes, I remember walking up the ladder of courtesy from your rejections, right?
Yeah. And what happened to me, maybe after my 10,000 hours, was I suddenly thought this. I suddenly thought, I have been doing this in the belief that I will be one of the few aspiring writers who gets to have some kind of life in letters. Every writer, which is roughly half the population of the United States, believes that. Almost all of them are unfortunately mistaken. I've assumed that I was among the unmistaken. What if I'm one of the mistaken? What about my life and experience would render that possibility out of the question? I thought, well, blow me. You know,
nothing.
What if I'm it's just not going to happen? Right. And I was no longer. It was. Let's just say it was a little late for pro ball or a concert career. Yeah. There were still other possibilities. Right. And I actually made a decision after some thought that if continuing to write meant never publishing or publishing occasionally in some tiny little magazine, teaching freshman comp at some little college. It's not what I want. That's not the life I had in mind. But I'll do it. Right. I will do it because I just want to keep writing. And I started writing this novel. I started seeing Ken Corbett, the man with whom I lived for 25 years, and we'd been dating for a while, and I thought, I should probably show him some writing. What if he doesn't like it? Do we still go out? I don't know. Well, let's see. So he showed him a couple of chapters, and he said, these are kind of interesting. Why don't you send one of them to the New Yorker? And I said, that's so sweet. What you don't understand is that after X number of stories from me, the New Yorker actually hired somebody. His name is Daniel Menaker, and his job is to sit. I'm sure he has other functions too there, but one of his jobs is whenever a story from Michael Cunningham comes into immediately
reject
write a long cryptic letter about how much he liked it and why it's not going to work out for the New Yorker. So really, in order for Kenny to understand early on how difficult my life was and how powerful were the forces arrayed against me, I said, okay, I'm going to take the most un-New Yorker passage possible. I'm going to take the passage that involves children on drugs, violent death, and sex in a cemetery and send it to the New Yorker. And you'll be I'll pick up the dry cleaning. The story will be back before I am. And of course, you know the punchline.
Right.
They took it.
Right.
Right?
Of course.
Right. And I think for me, what happened when I decided that it was acceptable to me to be unrecognized, something clicked, something freed up. I had, by slow degrees, without realizing it, been ever more ardently trying to write something that someone would publish. Mm-hmm. And the minute
you stop trying to write something,
myself from that, go figure.
Yeah, it's a little bit of it's like something from a YA book, right? But it's true. It kind of is. But it's true.
But much of life is like something from a YA book.
Right, but if I may say, Michael, it's a theme you dramatize in your fiction, in The Snow Queen, for instance. That's one of the crucial things that the second protagonist, that Tyler has to figure out in the book, is that he will write a great song when he stops trying to write a great song. Yeah. And that if he never writes a great song, that's an acceptable outcome too in the eyes of the universe.
Right.
And that's I think that's a significant thing. I think it's one of the things, in a weird way, though I practice on occasion as a critic myself. One of the things that separates critics who are artists or who understand it from those who don't, and that is that you don't set out to write a shapely book or a book that responds to the time. It's a lovely thing in Salinger. Remember when Buddy Glass, Seymour says to Buddy, all anyone will ask is, were all your stars out or not when you were writing? Nobody will ask, is it shapely, is it witty, is it a good reflection of its time? And I've always thought that was profoundly true. And it's one of the things that sort of is the only internal compass you can give yourself is this actually the thing that I want to be writing and that I feel is true to my experience of the world?
What made you start writing?
Oh, I can truly hardly remember a time when I wasn't writing. The first extended piece of fiction that I ever wrote was a spy novel called To Be or Not to Be, which I wrote when I was in 6th grade. It was somewhat inspired by The Man from U.N.C.L.E. and the James Bond films, and to my wife's great amusement, because it still exists to this day. It will be donated to the University of Texas at some point, right, for a tax deduction.
Oh, I look forward to that.
The spy has karate training, target practice, and then recess on his day. The first effective work of fiction I ever wrote was a letter I wrote to my parents when I was about 10, because I was very indignant. They had said I could go to a movie that weekend, and then they had taken it away because we had something else to do. It wasn't a privilege, it just was another plan. And I went up to my room and I wrote a 10-page indignant letter, and I slipped it under their door, explaining the basic injustice of it. And my father, bless him, an enormously kind and good man, came down and said, Adam, I had no idea you felt so strongly about this. Of course you can go to the movie. And I thought, oh, this is interesting.
And a career is launched.
And a career was launched. If you could organize your emotions of indignation and sense of injustice on paper and slip it under the world's door, so to speak, they would come to you and say, "Oh, I didn't know you."
Probably think of most writing as a letter
slipped under your parents' door. This is true. That's all. That's what writing is.
Detailing your complaints and explaining the full anguish that is your life.
What rarely happens to the writer is when your father comes to your bedroom then and says, "You were right in everything you wrote in the letter." That doesn't happen. Right.
That's the part that doesn't happen.
That's the hard part. So and I started writing then, and I can't really truly remember a day when I didn't write after. The one thing, do you not find this to be true, is that it gets harder, and in a certain sense, you get less adept at it. In other words, when I was 25 writing in a little room, I was chuckling at every sentence I wrote, thinking, as you did, "Oh, the New Yorker's going to love this," right? Shortly before going down to get it and have it come back. But you develop the one, you can't even call it an expertise. The one confidence I think you develop over time is that you do feel that it will be finished. In other words, that it will get will get done. You don't know how it will get done, but you have inductive experience that it tends to get done eventually, and that you can sort of go to sleep on that confidence. And there was a long period of time when you sort of don't believe it's going to ever get done, when you just feel...
Right. I think you sort of trade one lack of confidence for a new body of unconfidence. I feel like when you've been at it for a while, the big danger is beginning to feel competent at it, beginning to feel like an expert. I think then you are halfway to hackhood, and the good news and the bad news, as one is no longer a beginning writer or a particularly young writer, is you have to find a way to feel all of your writing life like you're a little out of your depth, like you don't really know what you're doing, like you're overreaching, and this time you're not going to pull it off.
Right. On the much more microscopic scale in which I write, my wonderful editor, Henry Finder, has a nice expression, which is, "Where's the left turn into traffic?" Right? In other words, where is it in the particular piece? Are we going to take a left turn into traffic? Because if you're just going along predictably, and everyone can anticipate where the end is from the first sentence, and so you have to take a left turn into traffic. I remember because it came up particularly. I was writing an essay called "Bumping into Charlie Ravioli" about my daughters. I exploit my children ruthlessly.
But I assume they exploit you as well.
They will be exploiting me. One of the rules I installed when beginning a family was no piercings below the navel and no bitter memoirs. But I'm promised that the bitter memoirs are on the way. In fact, they're written, titled, and shortly to be published. And I wrote this essay about her imaginary friend who was always too busy to play with her. Right. And the thing is, it was a wonderful story, invented entirely by Olivia. But the question was, what beyond the charm of the story about a 3-year-old growing up in New York with a too busy imaginary friend could you do with it? And I ended up writing something about Henry James, talking about writers sit over us, about Henry James's discovery of busyness at the end of the 19th century. When did life become too busy? That was a whole question. What did we mean by busyness? Because if you read someone like Samuel Pepys in the 17th century, busy for him is a synonym for happy, right? Oh, the day was fully busy. The day was completely busy. So that was sort of the left turn into traffic you had to take to do it. And I think that you're continually, as a writer, whether you're out on Route 6 as you are, you're navigating the little back roads as I do, that you're constantly trying to take that left turn into traffic.
I'm curious to hear you talk about this as it applies to nonfiction. I feel like any work of fiction is essentially a mystery story.
Yeah.
And its ancestor is the traditional whodunit. You're classing it up a little bit over certain mysteries you might buy in airports, which I love, by the way. But what you're doing is essentially parading the surprise right in front of the reader, but so diverting the reader's attention from where the story is ultimately headed that when it gets there, just like at the end of the mystery story when the murderer is revealed, the reader ideally feels like, oh, of course. Why didn't I see that coming? In a traditional mystery, it has to be the person who was right there in front of you and you didn't see. If it's just some psycho killer who comes out of nowhere, it's
like
no
at the
good.
end of True Detective last year, it was so disappointing. It just was psycho killer.
So I am very much aware in trying to put a novel together. Some of it, much of it is intuitive, but some of it is conscious too.
The parallel thing
to bury a surprise
of essay writing is exactly what I always say: is an essay is a work of nonfiction that different from other kinds of nonfiction, where the apparent object and the actual subject are different, and the fun of it for the reader and the little journey the reader makes is from what seems to be the object of the story to the actual subject of it. And that, for me, is where what distinguishes real essay writing from even the best kind of reporting is that it's written inside out. I did an essay not too long ago about learning to bake bread with my mother, my crazy mother in Canada. And the object of the piece was all about bread. There were recipes in it. There was stuff about yeast. There was stuff about temperatures. There was all those kinds of things. But the real subject of the piece was my relationship with my mother, and even more, this was the left turn into traffic, my mother's relationship with my wife, which had been a deep theme of my life. And I had totally forgotten that when my children hate when I use this participle, but when I was first courting my wife years ago, she had actually brought a loaf of bread that she had made herself into my mother's larder, where it had been neglected for 40 years. No one had even noticed, because my mother baked at such an incredible volume of croissants and donuts and brioche coming out that no single piece of baked dough would ever enter anybody's consciousness. And it had taken many decades before my wife could bring up the courage to remind me that I had betrayed her bread many years before. Anyway, that was the actual subject. It was a relationship with the two most important women in my life. And I think that's what any good essay does, is it starts you off on one object. It's like it's on its own miniature Lilliputian scale, like that it should, that it's both should be self-evident, but you don't know till the end.
I did a little bit of journalism years ago and wasn't especially good at it, and also found that I wasn't comfortable writing about actual people. I felt like it felt to me like what I was doing was of kind of seduction and betrayal. That I was part of my job was to make you feel so comfortable that you would tell me things
that were not in your interest,
not going to like to see in print, and I lost my mock. I didn't have it. I thought I'm going to write terrible things about invented people.
Well, Michael, this is something I think about a lot and I'm conscious of and worries me a lot. And here's the rationale I have come up with, and see if this seems so threadbare and nakedly inadequate or not to you. But it seems to me what all writers, whatever the form we choose, are up to, in a sense, is making private life public. That's one of the things that defines what we want to do. And we do it because we're interested in private life, but also because it's the one place where we can say, you know what, no matter how weird the monstrous little music inside your mind is, it's no weirder than the monstrous little music inside the minds of everybody you're going to encounter. And I feel that when you're writing nonfiction, and where that risk is always there, in a sense, you're trying to do the same thing, right? It's not that you can escape, I would think, into fiction and say, here, no one's feelings will be harmed, because I imagine that for it to have credibility and resonance, you have to draw on experience and firsthand things that you know. And though the world may not know who's been seduced and betrayed for a lifetime, that person will certainly know it. And I don't have the impression that Philip Roth, to name only masters, has gone through life with his family applauding every book one after another without difficulty.
My family. Oh, Dad, I hope you're not listening. My family has always had a hard time with
your books.
My novels for all the expected reasons they feel they see themselves portrayed. All that stuff. Here was the surprise. When they first read some of my fiction, they were shocked by my acquaintanceship with sorrow, frustration, disappointment, despair, and all I could say to them was, most sons choose professions in which all that stuff can be kept from you.
Yes. Right.
But this was I hadn't expected that one, that they were actually traumatized by the clear evidence that they had raised a boy who was sometimes deeply unhappy, because how would he know about this if he hadn't?
And this was not you had always shown them more or less a smiling face. They were not aware of that part of your nature.
No, we were one of those families that never fought, which was I think it's a mistake for families, really.
But the thing that I think is universally true, and it's because my point is exactly that, right? You can't write anything of any interest that doesn't involve the potential betrayal of somebody. And the one thing I've learned over the years of doing it is that you can never anticipate in advance. It will always be viewed either as a betrayal or a bear hug, and you don't know which way it will be. And the things that you imagine as you write them, as honestly and as empathetically as you can, will be seen as a betrayal, are often taken as a bear hug, and the things that you imagine will be delightful, a bear hug, filled with your delight and empathy in some eccentric character, will be seen as a fundamental betrayal, right?
Yeah.
Where you did it, and you don't know which way it will be. I felt that when I wrote the essay about my mother, which I was very anxious about doing, I thought, oh God, this is going to be an ugly Monday. There's a title for a YA book, Ugly Monday, right? When my mom reads this and feels that, that I've portrayed her as a rather comically excessive creative figure. But in fact, my mother read it and was delighted with it because she is a rather comically excessive figure, and that was it. So my feeling is that all of us sit on that same moral seat in a certain way, where we're constantly involved in making private life public, taking our observations of the world and turning them out, and that process of seduction and betrayal, though certainly one you can indict nonfiction writers with, is not one that the fiction writer can escape, not one that anyone who writes with any kind of energy or any kind of moral curiosity can escape. And we live within it, and we suffer from it, and we occasionally do the wrong thing because of it.
No, it's another thing I say to my students. Look, the odds are no one will write anything that's really any good. If your ambition is to write something good that will not trouble your grandmother, good luck to you.
Yes, exactly.
I feel, having discussed the mentality, I feel it's time for a horrifically sentimental anecdote.
All right.
Don't you think?
Yes, absolutely.
I was just thinking about, it's germane. I was thinking about betrayal and such. I wrote a novel in which my mother was, I wrote a character clearly based on my mother, which is not something I generally do. And for some reason, I thought she would be happy about that. Because what I had in my deranged mind was that the message she would get was, you have been important enough for somebody to take your life and put you in a novel. And I think a novelist's sense of a gift of that sort is a little bit like a cat's sense of a gift.
Right. It's dead and bleeding, but they think you'll value it.
Nice one, big one, right? Yeah, you happy? She wasn't happy, and I, in retrospect, understand that. And here comes
this is in the hours.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Here comes the sentimental part, but we are, for some of us are just forged right in. They were making a movie out of it, and Julianne Moore, genius, was playing a character based on my mother. And as they were shooting, but just before they started shooting the movie, my mother was diagnosed with cancer. Quite far along, one of those terrible things where they just missed it, and I was out in L.A. with my family. It's where I grew up. And they still live, and I called the producer, and I said, I have a feeling my mother won't get to see the movie. Is there anything you could do? And he had a messenger come over with about 20 minutes of dailies.
Of Julianne Moore's performance.
Including Julianne Moore's performance, and I found myself sitting on the sofa that we'd had since I was 15.
The very one you described in the...
Yeah, with my mother, who, as it turned out, though we didn't know then, would die in about 3 weeks, sitting with her, watching Julianne Moore play her as if she was being reincarnated while she was still alive. And she got that. That felt like a gift to her, which just really means that we should just write movies.
Yes,
about books, really.
But she read that as a validation of a kind. That
she did. I think prose by your son is just too close. But when she watched Julianne kind of do her, it was remarkable and a great gift.
That's wonderful. And so but I have to remember this.
I bet you can't top that for mawkishness and sentimentality.
When it comes to mawkishness and sentimentality, I just have to read from my work, Michael, and then I can.
I just read out a dead mother. Top that.
I have nothing to top a dead mother being played by Julianne Moore. I can nothing, and nothing in my experience can quite equal that. Did I tell a dog anecdote? I do have a cute dog anecdote. But I think that this is anyway. I think that that's true. I don't think that's a mawkish anecdote at all. I think that is a tender story about a son and a mother. And
I think about the power of narrative. Yeah. Again, I don't think it was movie versus book. I think it was the element of the extra element of detachment. It was not. It was not me writing about her. It was
a depiction in the world of her experience.
Amazing actor playing someone like her.
I think that's right. I hope when they make the bread essay that we'll get Julianne Moore to play my mother too, and then I'd be.
See what we can do about that.
Then I'd be vindicated. Absolutely.
Should we bring?
Turn it over to the audience?
I would love to talk to all the lovely people who climbed the hill and came here tonight.
Any questions on anything we've talked about or anything we haven't talked about?
Or anything you want to tell us about? I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, the first one is always the hardest and always the most loved.
What do you think about some of the much more sophisticated storytelling in television that's happening since when we were much younger? Are either of you addicted to any particular television shows? Do you avoid them? Do you wish you could write for them? Are you writing for them?
Should we repeat the questions? I suspect we're probably not going to.
Question is about long form television. We live in this what seems to be this golden age of where long form television, Mad Men, Breaking Bad, The Wire, and so on has displaced the novel in some ways as the central form of narration. Are either of us addicted to them or writing for them?
Yes and yes. No, I love television. I actually do think it's this incredible, rich period in television. There's so many great shows. And I don't know if we have time for me to list all the ones I watch, but it's just it happens throughout history. The aliens aim for mysterious reasons of their own the beam at certain people, certain modes of expression, and it's television now. Right. Television is amazing.
It was a Hollywood movie in the 1970s. Who can quite explain why?
Right. Why,
the English novel in the 1870s, and now we too. But you're actually working on something, Michael. You were saying.
I wrote a pilot episode for Showtime, which is in the hands right now of the head of Showtime, who is actually
do we know his name? We can write him letters.
No. He's just called the head. He's a disembodied blue-green
number one
head.
With a little cat,
kept in a chamber deep under the Arctic Circle, so the head of Showtime will survive nuclear holocaust.
Right. The limbs of HBO are in an adjacent.
Thing. No, but I wrote a pilot for a series, and I'm waiting to hear whether they want to do it or not.
No, my only problem, I love like everyone, and there's so many of those things that I do admire and watch. I do get this kind of clenched feeling in the pit of my stomach. I mean, I may have made a fool of myself reading Finnegan's Wake one summer, but when you see, everyone tells you've got to see The Americans, and you say, oh, this sounds good. You've got to see The Americans. You realize it's like 6 seasons of shows, right? And you realize it's going to be this incredible commitment. It's like
I know.
It's like a blind date that involves instant marriage.
It's like Proust. It's like, it's so big.
It's so big, and how are you ever going to do it? And I know the answer is that you just have to make yourself very ill, and then you do binge watching for.
I do that. I inject myself.
But I love,
so I can watch TV.
But I love that stuff. The only thing I'd say is that invariably in those kind of golden moments where art and entertainment seem to meet and dance successfully, however briefly, like the 70s in Hollywood, something comes along to destroy the secret equilibrium that was allowing that to happen. For instance, that the cable companies, the cable networks don't need ratings particularly. They just need a growth in subscribers. That's been a real propellant for this. But there was that great moment in Hollywood in the early 1970s. Then Jaws came along, and the producers realized
changed the game.
Right. Oh, we don't have to make Chinatown and The Godfather complicated films with pessimistic morals. We can make big, spectacular things that open in 1,000 screens. And in a weekend, that golden moment was crushed. I fear
that's why you want to write a TV pilot
now. Exactly.
Because it's not going to be like this forever.
No, I think that's
TV
right.
people themselves are really excited about TV to the point where they don't actually need the shows to make $1 bazillion.
Exactly.
Imagine being that excited.
Yes, exactly.
There's nobody in the movies like that.
No. So it will. I suspect it will end, but it's a
glorious
thing now.
But it's here now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Was there a hand
over there, lady in stripes here?
Today on NPR, they were interviewing a woman writer, and because on NPR was in my car radio, I came into the middle of it, and then I left before it ended, so I don't know who it was, but she was writing about when she decides to start writing a novel, she gets an intense fear. I'm just wondering if either of you ever felt any kind of fear when you decided to write.
I think that was my mother, actually, that they were interviewing.
Yeah, the question is somebody on NPR, a writer who's talking about starting a novel and feeling this deep fear about embarking.
Well, I'm not a novelist properly so called. I write imitation novels for children when I do write them. Someday I hope to write a novel, but not that the world needs another novel. I guess the truth is that you feel. The truth is, and this will sound terrible, I know, is that one of the good things I think about going on writing for a while is that some of the melodrama gets drained of it. At least to me, it does begin to feel a little bit more like I'm doing this gig because what I do is I go on gigs and play them. And
you seem to be surviving your life as a writer.
Yeah, exactly. And so
which was not at all clear at
No,
25.
Yeah. Not at all. And I think that sort of does change the thing. You also know, in some sense, and this is the sort of scary part you try and keep down, that every writer you admire. Do you ever think about this, Michael? Every writer you admire has a high period. He or she has a high period. And since the high period is almost always about 10 to 15 years, you know that yours is over, right? You know that you are writing on the other side of the high period. Either that or you're in the middle of it, but that doesn't seem very likely.
Which is one of the reasons I love a writer like Philip Roth.
Yes.
Who had a very early high period and then a sort of middle period, and then lo and behold, at a no longer young age, just hit
older than either of us, thankfully.
Yes. And wrote profound, mature novels of a kind that could only have been written by a mature mind.
That's right. I think that's one of the reasons why Philip Roth is a favorite of everyone but the Swedish Academy.
Just quickly, fear is not quite the word, but I'm just the opposite. The woman on NPR, I start a novel with tremendous optimism and brio, and because this one is going to be
the great one.
Yeah. And the whatever it is, the bad feelings come at the end, toward the end, when I realize it seems to have some good parts, but it's not the vastness that I had in mind. It's not the human story that's floating over all of our heads simultaneously in this room right now, right? It's a story too big to tell. It's a story that's untellable because there are passages for which there is no language. And if you are sufficiently delusional, I am sufficiently delusional. I actually start a novel thinking I might approximate that. Right. And it's only as it gets toward the end that I realize, oh, yeah, it's just this book. It's just this book. It's not a bad. I hope it's not a bad book, but it's not. It's not the book of books. It's not the cathedral made of fire and light.
I have the same exact feeling. When you start, you think this will be the story of my generation, and when you're done, you think there's a funny bit on page 175. And between those two states is where a writer's life I think is spent. And the only thing I'd say is I'd add to that is you do have this, at least I do, and maybe it's sentimental in that way. You do have the sense that was there some piece of experience, some piece of your own memory, whether it's direct or in the prismatic form of fiction, that you've finally gotten down, and you think you've gotten down a little bit right. For me, that's a terribly important part of it.
Oh, absolutely. No, I mean, if the writing process were devoid of satisfactions and interludes of genuine pleasure, I wouldn't do it. No, I'm not that masochistic.
No,
and I think many writers like to sort of emphasize the difficulty of it, which really could not be overemphasized. But we also sort of shortchange just what you say. That passage that feels like this seems true and real.
And this is something that has always been a little lodged, like it's a way of melting all those little slivers of ice that have gone into our eyes through writing that.
Ooh, good line. Good line.
Yeah, it's yours. Someone else here? Lady up front?
This is addressed to Michael. I know, because I've been reading what's happening in some of the galleries, that you're going to be doing a collaboration with a conceptual artist, Richard Dorff, I believe. Sometime in August.
I am, in fact.
And I was very interested in that, so this seems to be an opportunity to ask you what that's all about.
If you didn't hear, Michael is working on a collaboration with the artist Richard Dorff here in Provincetown in August. And what's that all about?
There is this fantastic new gallery. Well, new. I think this is her third year. Deb Novotny, the AMP Gallery on the West End, which is doing something that few other galleries in Provincetown are doing. She's pushing the proverbial envelope. There's art on the walls that's for sale, just like in any other gallery, and the art on Deb's walls is very good, but she's also bringing in musicians and arranging collaborations, and yet, honestly, we've agreed to collaborate. We haven't talked about it yet. Maybe we'll just show up that night and see what happens. But no, I'm enormously excited about working with an artist in another medium. I don't get to do that nearly often enough.
Fantastic.
We're looking forward to it.
Great.
Lady down here.
Hi. Thank you both so much for your work and for this lovely evening, first of all. And
thank you.
You said early in the night that you never read reviews
Mm-hmm.
of your work. And it's something I hear artists and writers say a lot. I never read reviews. And it's very definitive, and I'm curious about that. Has that always been true? Do you want to read the reviews, but you keep yourself from them? What's that process like for you? And then you're a writer and sometimes a critic, and how does that work for you? So I'm just curious, more thoughts on the subject of reading reviews of one's own work.
Let me just repeat the question. So, question is that Michael and I both lied and said we never read our reviews, and the woman is asking us to tell the truth in response about all the reviews we read. But seriously, do you? And also asking me if, as somebody who's occasionally a critic or often a critic, if that affects my writing. Have you really found the discipline not to read
people
reviews?
Don't believe me, but it's true. It's true. I'm sure many writers are lying when they say they don't read reviews. I stopped at a certain point. I cannot imagine publishing a first novel and not reading the reviews. But you get to your third or your fourth novel, and you begin to understand that the good ones aren't all that helpful, either because you don't feel like they really got they weren't really impressed by the things you
that were impressive
that were impressive to you, or you know, I'll confess it. There is a certain sense that after the trouble it's taken to write a novel, no one can possibly compensate you with no matter what. So it always feels like bad reviews. The really lethal bad review is not the one that's just, you know, so off the mark that you think, well, baby, I guess this novel wasn't for you, was it? Because you didn't even know what it's about. The really dangerous bad review is the one that points to actual failings in the novel that you hoped were minor, and says, no, they're major, they're terminal, they killed the book. And I cannot imagine any point in exposing yourself to that review. And really and truly, believe me or don't, I stopped. I got it. It was a little like flossing. Like I had to get into the habit of not reading them, and it took a while. But I don't, and I don't miss them.
Well, just to answer the second half of your question, right, about writing, I don't review books as a rule, which is a very infuriating thing that I'm allowed to do. Very often I'll be given books to review, and I'll sum up the book in the first few paragraphs and then write the book the author should have written had he been written the right book in the next 8,000 words. Infuriating habit that the New Yorker licenses us to do occasionally. I will say that I think that the one thing I hope that being actually a writer who writes criticism rather than that god-awful thing, a professional critic, is that, so it refers to something we were talking about before. The thing that drives me crazy in any kind of criticism is the notion that you set out in a certain way, that the variation in your work is a consequence of you're not taking it sufficiently seriously or not working as hard at it. And the one thing I think is true of every writer of any interest at all is that exactly the same amount of passion, care for detail, belief in the subject, endless anxiety about each sentence and every comma infuses the whole of it. So the variation in your work, that some things work for a lot of people and other things don't, is a function much more of the reception than it is of the intention, it seems to me. And that, I think, is the one thing that writers and artists of all kinds understand, and that critics, as a rule, don't, because they have the bad habit of grading, and they have the notion that, if you had stayed up later to finish the book, they would have been able to give you an A. And you stayed up as late as you can, and you still, can't get it. And that, I think, is the one thing that's always true. And it drives me crazy a little bit when people are writing about. I wrote this in a piece not long ago but I don't think I kept it in, actually, is that I guarantee you that if all of Salinger's supposedly unpublished manuscripts ever do see the light of day, there will be some totally atypical thing of his, like a murder story set in New Hampshire, written in taut, bare prose. And the New York Times will say, finally, Mr. Salinger has broken out of his sentimental and prolix habits and written something good, because what critics are looking for is something that doesn't share the commonality of all of your enterprise in a certain way. And that part of it drives me a bit nuts. And it's the one thing I consciously try to avoid is patronizing artists of any kind by imagining that they were in a certain sense attempting to please me or write to a certain artificial mark.
Just very quickly, I want to add, I feel like for me, the important relationship is not between a writer and critics, but between a writer and readers. Yes. And I'm not thinking about the critics, but I'm thinking very much about readers, about whoever's out there who is intelligent and discriminating and available to emotion, and is going to take the book in a way that involves being affected or unaffected by it, as opposed to sort of evaluating it.
Amateur readers.
I'm all about readers. You know, a book is certainly a novel. I think any work of writing is I think to me fundamentally this sort of intense, sexy, funny, difficult exchange of experience between a writer and a reader, albeit separated in time and space. And one of the things that I love about prose, which is different from any other narrative medium, is first the writer writes the book, and then the reader writes the book. No one in this room has read the same Anna Karenina or the same Bleak House. You sort of set down the blueprint, and then the reader imagines whatever the reader imagines. And I love that.
This is true. No, I think the essential relationships for a writer are with readers and Amazon reviewers. Those are the other people.
Well, yeah,
those are the other people you gotta
and movie producers.
And movie producers, right? And people who take options. Absolutely.
Should we have one more and let everyone release
for
everyone
dinner?
into this lovely, soft main night? Yes, please.
Sorry, I guess the lead-in is kind of more directed to you, Michael, because it's relevant to like the students that you teach. You guys were talking earlier about earnestness and like sentimentality in writing, and that being a really hard thing for college students to kind of like force themselves to do. And I'm a rising junior at Yale actually, and took Daily Themes this semester, which is a class where you write supposedly every day a week for like 5 days a week. Yeah, and like the one constant struggle I was having all semester was kind of wrestling with like two maxims of writing that I'd heard in previous classes of like getting to sentiment, not sentimentality, and also showing and not telling. But I feel like I don't really know still what the line is, but there were some days when I think I kind of like went too far into sentimentality, which I guess the question is for both of you now, and some days where I don't think I revealed enough and don't think I was like honest enough. And I don't know how you guys like what your scales are for yourself, or kind of like how you determine that.
Could you take a crack at
well, I'll take a crack at a little piece of the segment, the showing, not telling, because the question. Repeating the question. Oh, sorry. So the question is about learning to write, and a couple of the things that come up when you're studying literature and writing in university is the business of getting to sentiment, not sentimentality, something we've talked about, and also about showing, not telling. That these are important things, but they can seem somewhat mysterious and Zen-like, if I understand you, when you're tackling them. And I just was going to address the second part of it, and that is the showing, not telling, because I've just been in the middle of writing a play, a musical comedy that I've been working on for the past few years. And boy, that's what the director is telling me at every moment, right? He said, we cannot take one more aphorism. We cannot endure another epigram. These people have to relate to each other rather than speaking in prose. And I actually wrote on my big book of the show, dramatic, not epigrammatic, on the thing, because there's a certain sense, an interesting sense, in which a play can't be well written. In other words, if everybody in the play is speaking the kinds of beautiful sentences that we strive for in our prose, the play is totally inert, right? Because it has no dramatic life. So this business of learning, in that sense of showing and telling, the business of learning to dramatize rather than aphorize has been an absolute struggle for me in the course of writing this musical comedy. Fortunately, you get the relief of the lyrics to the songs, which are a model of tight aphoristic and actually rhymed writing. So I have to get through, it's like whitewater rafting, all these hard parts where people actually have to be relating to each other rather than simply saying graceful sentences. And then I get to create the graceful sentences and lyrics. But boy, writing a play will show you everything that writing of our kind, everything that graceful sentences cannot accomplish.
Yeah, I think the good news and the bad news is that all these questions, is it too much? Is it not enough? Is it just sentimental enough? Is it a little over the line? Is a question you have to answer on your own. Your teachers can help you with that, but writing is a mysterious process. And anybody who teaches writing can do neither more nor less than tell you, as far as I can tell, it seems usually to work this way. run screaming from any teacher who tries to tell you categorically, we do this and we don't do that as a writer. The question, because part of what you're doing, I think, as a writing student is not just learning how to write, it's discovering the kind of writer you are. It's finding your voice. It's finding your own relationship to muchness or littleness or lessness, to sentimentality or the abhorrence of sentimentality. Because as we noted earlier, there's Dickens, but there's also Paul Bowles. I mean, you can't really point to any group of great writers and say, well, writing works this way or writing works that way. You know what I think the best test of a piece of writing is, and it's so simple. Read it to some people.
Watch their faces.
Gather together some kindred spirits, people who care about you and who care about you enough to tell you if it's not working for them, and just put it out into live air and see how it's received by live ears.
And one of the fascinating things is something you learn too when you're doing work on the stages. You almost don't have to wait to hear what they think. That if you bring a group of people together and you start to read, there's something palpable in the air that tells you whether it is landing, as we say on Broadway, or not. In truth, it's one of the eerie and mysterious things. But you start reading, and to 5 people, and you know within 3 sentences if it's succeeding or not.
Yeah, I mean, and certainly fiction, which is not performed generally, is descended from storytelling. Is people sitting around a campfire telling each other stories, and now it's just too difficult to get enough people around a campfire, so we actually have to write it down and publish it and send it out without the benefit of either our own voices or the benefit of our ability to gauge people's reactions. But really, that's what it is. It's sit down. I have something to tell you. And then you just see how that relationship between storyteller and listener goes.
And if I can just give you the best piece of editorial advice I ever got was in that context of storytelling. It was from my son, Luke, who was about 10, and I was writing a book for him, which eventually was called The King in the Window, and I was telling him the story every night, and I read him the first couple of chapters of it once I had organized it. And I said, this is real. It's not just a bedtime story. I'm thinking of publishing this. Tell me what you think. And there was stuff. There were sword fights and amazing apparitions. And then there was some very philosophical and narrative stuff. And Luke listened to it very seriously and said, Dad, it's good. He said, could you just bring the cool bits closer together? And I went in the next day to David Remnick, the editor of the New Yorker. I said, you don't have to work. You can go fishing now. Just send to every writer who sends in a manuscript. It's great. Could you just bring the cool bits closer together? And that's all that you need to do is bring the cool bits closer together, and you will have something that is composed ultimately of nothing but cool bits. And that's all we dream of doing in writing is...
That's all you have to do. Just bring the
cool bits closer together.
It's easy, really.
Isn't it? It's easy.
Dr. Gopnik, should we send these lovely people out?
I think we should. I absolutely think we should, Dr. Cunningham. And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.